You might hear trumpet in the background. My son is practicing trumpet, so just consider it a bonus musical accompaniment. I'll be talking about Henry James today. Someone once asked the great 20th century, mid 20th century writer Flannery O'Connor, who were her influences. And she said in a very low voice, Henry James, Henry James, Henry James, which was kind of a joke, but not really. James is one of these writers who was a writer's writer. And what I mean by that is that writers learn how to write, not only by reading Henry James, but also by reading the voluminous essays and prefaces to his own books, which explain how he wrote them, by reading his letters as a kind of a master class in how to create short stories and novels. So he's what we call a writer's writer. Not all writers, write that much about writing, but James was one of our first and greatest to do so in the late 19th, early 20th century. And in the preface to A Portrait of a Lady, that he wrote, 20 years, 25 years after he wrote the book, it's being reissued, he talks about something very important, something that really taught me how to look at literature in a way I hadn't looked at it before. And it has to do with point of view. And James creates the metaphor in that preface of what he calls the house of fiction. He says the house of fiction has many windows, which is a takeoff on a line from the Bible, I believe. My father's mansion has many rooms. James says, the house of fiction has many windows. And if we were face to face here, what I would do now is I would draw very crudely, a picture of a house with many different shaped windows. And some of them would be kind of like a standard window, like a rectangular window. Some of them would be very narrow and, not tall but narrow. Some of them would look like your television screen does, which is, kind of a panoramic size. It's tall, but it's wider than it's tall, but it's closer to the way we actually, with peripheral vision, with our eyes, see the world. And then there might be just like a round window in the house as well, kind of like a peephole or something like that, or a triangular window, or a skewed window. Like in movies when you realize somebody's crazy in a film, they tilt the camera to show that this person is off-centered. They're crazy, so they lean. So this house has all these crazy different windows. Depending on which window you look at or look out of, you're going to see a very different scene. If I look through the peephole, I'm just seeing, if I were in front of a class, I'd see like one student's face. If my window is more like what your television screens look like now, something close to the CinemaScope or panoramic theater created in the 1950s, I would see the whole class, and I'd see almost the whole, from floor to ceiling. If I were looking at it through a triangular window and so on, you get the point. I would be, the window frames what I see. Now, this is meant to mimic these different shaped windows, the different ways that people perceive the world, because people do perceive the world very differently. Each one of you listening to me and watching me on this camera are seeing somebody different. You may like me, you may dislike me, you may think, oh, he looks cool, you may think, why does that guy cut his hair? He has a stain on his shirt, whatever. I don't know. Politically, we put on, glasses when we see the world. And we see the world according to politics. Some people look at Donald Trump and think he's a hero. Other people look at him and think he's, a con man. And, they see the world very differently based upon their political philosophy. We literally see the world differently based upon how we think about it. Doctors see the world different than the rest of us. They can just look at somebody and see illness. Cops see the world differently. There's no way, even when they're off duty, they're still spotting those expired inspection stickers. I don't do that. I'm not a cop. So depending upon your religion, your ideology, or just who you are personally, or, a combination of all of those things, you view the world very differently. So we're all looking out our own very individual window. And James talks about these different shaped windows as a way of indicating that. And that's point of view, right? That's how the world is seen. Now, there's first-person point of view, which James almost never uses. He uses it in The Turn of the Screw, and I think in one other short story or novella. um, which is the most limiting of all points of view because you only get to see and hear and know what that person sees and hears and knows. Second person is weird. It's you do this and you do that. It's almost never used, so I won't talk about it. Third person is he, she, not I, as in the first person, or you, as in the second person, but he or she. And I often have my students in creative writing classes, when they write their first short story, when I give them say, write a short story, many of them write in the first person because they have a story about themselves that they want to write about. I always send those stories back and say, I want you to change this from the first to the third person and use he and she. And when they do that, the story almost always becomes better because now they're forced to really view the world as opposed to talk about what somebody sees or perceives. And they almost immediately begin to create more conflict and have more of a story than when everything's centered in that first person consciousness. And then there's what's called the omniscient point of view, in which you can move back and forth between points of view. In Madame Bovary, for example, by Gustave Flaubert, there's a scene where Madame Bovary and her husband, who's a doctor, are sitting in front of a fire, and they're both deep, they're in armchairs in front of this fire, big fireplace, bunch of logs crackling, some fireplace instruments on the side there, on the hearth of the fireplace. And I think we start off with Madame Bovary's thoughts, and she's having an affair with some much better looking and richer guy in Paris because they live in like the suburbs, they're actually out in the country. And she's cheating on him in the big city. She has her own thoughts, and we don't know what his thoughts are. Then Flaubert describes one of the logs cracking and some of the coals spilling out onto the hearth dangerously close to the rug. The husband gets up, takes a fire tool, a little shovel or something, scoops the coals back into the fire and sits back down. When he sits back down, we're in his thoughts. It's an omniscient narration. We can go inside many different characters, inside their thoughts. But the action that he takes seamlessly moves us from her consciousness to his consciousness. And writers are very clever at how they engineer these things so that as a reader, we aren't shaken by, now we're in his thoughts. And he creates an action for that man to perform. And then when he sits back down, we're in his consciousness. And we hardly even notice that there's been this change. So the omniscient narration allows us to, really know everything. James says the most important thing is for it to be clear who is seeing and hearing what at all times. And he came up with a combination of the omniscient narration, or the third-person narration, and the first-person narration, which uses a single character, not in the first person, but uses a single character and what that person sees and hears and knows as the exclusive focal point of the work. Now, I asked you, who's the main character in Daisy Miller? Sounds like a trick question, right? Like, who's the woman in the yellow wallpaper? So it must be a trick question. It can't be Daisy Miller. And in fact, if you look at the full title of the work, it's called Daisy Miller, A Study. Well, who's studying whom? And it turns out that Winterbourne is, of course, the main character in the story. He's told at the beginning of the story not to mess around with this young girl from America. He hasn't been in America in 10 years. He doesn't understand how much more independent and forward women are from America. And his aunt tells him at the very beginning of the story, don't fool with this woman, this young woman, because you're bound to make a mistake and you might even hurt her. And of course, he does, in a way, contribute to her death at the end of the story. So she was right about that. It's forecast at the beginning and it comes true. Everything in that story that we see or hear or know comes through Winterbourne. And he's the one who really undergoes, of course, poor Daisy dies, but she's not the main character. Winterbourne is the one who really goes through a change. It's focused on his understanding of the great mistake that he's made. So he is our point of view. Now, to get back to James's House of Fiction, this is how this works. There's a window, okay? Who's looking out the window in Daisy Miller? Well, it's Winterbourne. And Winterbourne is seeing Daisy through his own particular point of view. As someone who does not understand these young women coming over to Europe from America anymore. He knew the young women of his own generation. He doesn't understand these women. He himself is not exactly innocent. He's having an affair with an older married woman. So he has a lot of experience and a lot of ways of looking at the world. He understands Europe much better than poor Daisy does because she's just newly arrived. So he has a way of looking that is very distinct and tied to his own experiences, age, personality, education, and so on. So he has a window that he's looking out of. And that helps us understand something about the question of Daisy's innocence. Well, how can we know if Daisy's innocent or not when everything that we're really seeing is being seen by him and he's not understanding her? He's in a way what they call an unreliable narrator, but he's really more like an unreliable viewer. He has biases against her. And but James goes further than this. Who's behind Winterbourne looking out the window? Well, that's the author. The author has created a character, and we watch the author watch the character. And then there's one more person, James says, who's behind all this, and that's you, the reader. When we read anything, this is the lesson for today, you are watching the writer watch his character watch the world. And that's the multidimensional level of literature.